Yes, I mean, all of you, just, good evening, friends. Welcome to the 25th and final session of the South Asian Online Literary Conference. And we have 6 people, 6 scholars, and 3 interviews. The first one to begin with, we will have Kamrul Hassan. He will be in conversation with Bimal Guha. Please, both of you introduce yourself, and including your introduction, the topic you're going to discuss, and the entire duration of your conversation is 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste, everybody. I'm Kamrul Hassan, and I'm honored to interview one of our significant poets, Dr. Bimal Guha, here today. The theme will be our Bangladesh poetry and also a reflection of world poetry and Bangla poetry's place in the world literature. First, I will introduce myself. I'm a poet, and I have some 12 books of poems and 2 collections of poetry. I also write short stories. I have only 1 book of short story collection. I write essays on poetry. I have 2 books on that. In recent time, I'm writing travelogues. So I have 5 books, 5 travelogues already written. I'm writing a few more. I have participated in South Asian Festival of Literature several times and had been to Delhi. And so Bimalda was also there. Dr. Bimal Guha, whom I will interview today, is a significant poet of Bangladesh. He was born in 1952 and in Chittagong, southeastern part of Bangladesh, a very beautiful place of Bangladesh. He was a professor in Dhaka University and earned his PhD also from there, same university. He has some 36 books, most of which are books of verses. And he also joined this festival several occasions. And he's contributing to Bangla poetry with his thematic diversity and also a lot of technical virtuosity. His themes of his poetry revolve around war of liberation of Bangladesh and eternal subjects like nature, love, modernism, and humanity. He has earned several prizes and awards from different literary organizations. One significant award was given by the government of Bangladesh in 1979, I'm sorry, as a best young poet. So Bimalda, I welcome you to this session, and
thank you.
I feel happy to ask you a few questions. As I said, that our interview will revolve around Bangla poetry and your role in that there. So my first question to you, Bimalda, is you started writing poems right after the liberation of Bangladesh in 1971. And we have seen there was an upsurge of poetic flow in Bangladesh literature in that decade, in the 70s, right after liberation. So can you throw some light on it?
Well, thank you all. Oh, yes, we entered into the field of literature after the liberation war of Bangladesh with overwhelming emotions of liberation. We have a new flag then, and an independent state that we liberated from our occupation forces, Pakistani forces, through armed struggle. During 71, we have also, I was also involved in Indian evacuee camp in inspiring youth to join our liberation war as a volunteer for 9 months. You know, after our liberation, a very good number of rising poets gathered in the scenario in the arena of Bangla literature. Some remarkable voices were identified among them, who have been contributing significant contribution to our literature from even today. we have inherited our poetry from our predecessors, but the tone of our poetry after Liberation War is just different from the previous decades, both in content and in style.
Thank you, Dr. Bimal Guha. My next question is that what we call the decade of 70s, right after our liberation war, you were very active in that decade. In fact, you started writing and you have a lot of writings in that decade. Now, my question is that how would you characterize that particular decade in the history of Bangladesh poetry?
Oh, yes, it is so, Kamrul. Generally, we are called as the poet of 70s, but I believe a poet is a poet for all time, all times. However, it is comfortable for critics to identify poets by decades for their easiness in writing criticism only. Poetry of our decade after Liberation War has witnessed remarkable changes in the content, approach, and way of expression. We, the poet of that decade, are the product of social changes during that time. But our poetry focuses the value of a struggle against injustice and sacrifice of life for the cause of freedom. Poetry has been enriched with new words, similes, metaphors, and so on in our time. And that is also different from our previous decades.
Okay, Bimalda, thank you. As a prominent poet, my next question is that as a prominent poet of the 70s, how do you characterize your own poetry? In what way your poems are different or similar to the main trend of the poetry of 70s in Bangladesh?
Many poets, I have talked about it before, many poets join in the same platform of our decade, but each of them has their own tone, own voice, and their expression is also different from one another. Hence, we are the poet of the same, though we are the poet of same decades, many of us are different in their writing style and poetic diction. My poetic tone, poetic expressions, and style of writing are not exactly the same of the poets of our same decades, but we try to see the scenario from different angle and try to express our thought with different similes and metaphors. Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, my next question is that the War of Liberation of Bangladesh has left a big impact on our every aspect of our life, economy, politics, and literature as well. How do you assess that impact? Could you achieve an expected level of the kind of writing that we actually expected to come out of this bitter struggle, our bloodshed, and the sacrifice of the martyrs? How do you assess the impact of that war on Bangla literature?
The liberation war of Bangladesh has inspired very much in our literature I have discussed, but the liberation war of Bangladesh has inspired our cultural activists also from different genres of their field, their time. Many books, including poetry, novels, poems, and different songs, dramas have been written. It seems there are many more things to capture of that time. Even we are waiting for someone who can write an epic in a day, and we shall have to wait for that time for decades. and we are waiting for a person, for a writer who will do this. But we can also remember many of our intellectuals in cultural and literary field have just killed just before the liberation, just a few days before the liberation of Bangladesh, just before the occupation, or just before their surrender, the time of their surrender on the 16th December. They killed some of our intellectuals on the 14th of December, just 2 days before. So this is a gap also, but still the intellectuals and the literatures are contributing much more to our literature.
Thank you. My next question is that this year we are celebrating the Golden Jubilee of Bangladesh liberation. 50 years have passed since our independence. And in over these 5 decades of time, how much poetry and literature, Bangla literature in Bangladesh has changed from that part where you started the journey, 1970s. What changes you see in today's literature in Bangla today?
I have talked before, just before that, we are the successor of our predecessors after the partition of India as well as partition of Bengal in 1947. Since 50s and 60s, our poetry has been enormously enriched with both content and form. The Liberation War had left a great impact on our literature, mostly on poetry, and our poetry now has reached at a level of international standard that can be compared with any poetry with any parts of the world. We believe we are no inferior to any other now.
As you said that, I can ask a relevant question that it is more than 100 years, 108 years exactly that Rabindranath Tagore won the first Nobel Prize in Literature for Bangla as well as for Asia. Now, why Bangla literature being so powerful as we read and claim did not receive a second Nobel Prize in all these years? What is your assessment about it?
Of course, Bangla literature has contributed much more in the literary scene of the world, but we believe we have some more poets who could receive Nobel Prize. Even I can name 3 poets of 30s. We call poet of 30s in the decade of 30s. At least 3 poets and 3 novelists could get a Nobel Prize in Bangla literature. That is, I can name them. The poet Jibanananda Das could get it. Vishnudev could get it. Even Buddhadev Bose could get it. Even among our novelists, Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay, Manik Bandyopadhyay, Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay, and some other poets and novelists could get a Nobel Prize. But the problem probably with translation or their focus in the international arena. This is our limitations, I think.
I also believe that we could not translate our works into Western standard, what they read. In this context, I also wondered that not only Bangla literature, other Indian language literatures are also powerful. There are many powerful writers in different languages of India. None of them have received so far, got nomination, but never got the Nobel Prize. Do you think it's a biased decision by the Nobel Committee, or it's a geopolitical game they are playing?
Now, you know, from India, some persons even in economics got Nobel Prize, but not in literature. It is very sad. We know all prizes are biased in a certain level. All prizes.
Yes.
And there are some writers and poets in India outside Bangla literature who are of an international standard. We have come to know from FOSWAL deliberations and congregations, but I did not know their limitations. why it happens, and it is so. But I think the problem lies with the projection of their works to the world community. And like us, the geopolitics also plays a very important role in this regard.
So again, we come back to the lack of translation.
Professor Kamrul Hassan, last question, please.
Okay, sir, last question. My last question is about the age of internet, computer, and digitalization, this online media. Even we are now talking online. So many people have skepticism that where will be the place of printed books, printed media, and so on. How do you see that? You see the future as a poet, Professor Bimal Guha, that shall printed books will survive in the future?
Now, I believe printed book will continue side by side with this social media also, because the printed book it has some other value. So I think printed books will be for more than 100 years with other platforms, social platforms, and after 100 years the scenario could be different. But I believe, firmly believe, that it will continue for more 100 years, and we can hardly foresee the future.
Thank you very much, Professor Bimal Guha. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ajitji. Thank you.
Maji, thank you. Namaste.
And our next set of conversations, the first one will feature Jackie Kabir in conversation with Niyaz Zaman of Bangladesh. Like the rules are same, 15 minutes including introduction. Please, Ms. Jackie, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, and I'm sorry about the glitches at the beginning of the show. I'm a writer and translator from Bangladesh, and Dr. Niyaz Zaman, as we all know, she's a writer, translator, editor, and also publisher. And she has bagged many awards, including the National Archive Award, Atwar Hussain Award, Asia Week Award, Onanya Sahitya Puruskar, Lekhika Sangha Sahitya Puruskar, and in 2017, she got the Bangla Akademi Award for translation. So I would like to talk to Mrs. Zaman about her writing first. You have written numerous books, and your first book was The Art of Katha Embroidery, that was published in 1981. Since then, you have written many books. I would just like to ask you, how do you go on, or what makes you go on writing till now?
Thank you. First of all, Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, and namaste. Thank you, Sahitya Akademi and FOSWAL, for inviting us and for organizing this wonderful conference. Thank you, Jackie. Yes, I have written different types of books because I have varied interests and I can't sit idle. But all my interests did not start at the same time. In fact, my interest in translation began only in the late 70s, and that was thanks to poet Asad Chaudhry.
You have translated all of Qazi Nazrul Islam's novels, and you brought out several volumes on his works, Anxieties and Influences, Poetry, Politics and Passion, Qazi Nazrul Islam Selections 1 and 2. What inspired you to work on Qazi Nazrul Islam? And we talked about Nobel Prize a bit earlier. Maybe we would have, we could mention Qazi Nazrul Islam's name as one of our writers who should be getting the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, why not? Yes.
I haven't greeted Ajit Kaurji. Sat Sri Akal, Ajit Kaurji. Thank you so much for continuing and for being present at this session. Why did I become interested in Qazi Nazrul Islam? I teach English literature. I don't teach Bangla. But I belong to a reading group. And in 2011, we celebrated the 90th anniversary of the poem Bidrohi. We read the poem in Bangla and we read the translations. Members were very unhappy with the translations. They said none of the translations did any justice to the original. I explained that translation is very difficult, and translating a poet like Nazrul especially Bidrohi, with its, its force as well as its soft, messages of love and romance, is extremely difficult. And I suggested that as an exercise, we try and translate his novel Bandonara, which is in letters. While we were it was just an exercise, but one of my friends mentioned this to the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, and he was very interested in the volume. The only thing he wanted was a lot of pictures. So I approached a publisher who was interested, and he brought out this volume, a hard cover with a lot of pictures and glossy paper. But after 2 years, he was able to bring out trade volume, as they call it. Subsequently, I translated Mrityu Khudha and Kuhilika. I co-translated it with Dr. Muhammad Qayyum. At that time, someone approached me and asked me if I would be interested in an anthology containing translations of various genres of Nazrul's writings. I accepted it because, as everyone said, Nazrul is not known. Rabindranath Tagore became famous. He is globally known. He is known all over the world. But Nazrul, from some reason, is not known. So I accepted the challenge, and I invited translators from India and Bangladesh to put together, to translate his poems, his songs, his short stories, and this was subsequently published. And I became interested when I started translating. I became interested in other aspects of Nazrul, and I'm very grateful to FOSWAL, because whenever I get the chance, I would present a paper on Nazrul, and that is how I got a number of papers to put together in a book.
How lovely. In your earlier interview, well, I interviewed you earlier, you mentioned that people outside Bangladesh only know about few writers of our country. Has the scenario changed now? Are more Bangladeshi writers being known in the international arena?
Yes. Thank you, Jackie, for that question. Well, that was what was the situation in the mid-90s. And in fact, I'll mention the name. I had, in fact, gone to Delhi, and someone met me and saw that I was from Bangladesh. And the second question was, how is Taslima Nasreen? But things have changed over these years, and a lot of Bangladeshi writers are known. Many of them because they write in English. For example, Adib Khan and Seasonal Adjustments in 1994, Tahmima Anam. But there are also other writers like Zia Haider Rahman and Rahat Abir, who was present yesterday in one of the sessions and has won a number of prizes. But books by Bangladeshi authors are being translated. Salina Hussain has been translated into many Indian languages. Jackie, you have translated 2 of her novels, which have been published in India. In fact, Jackie, one of your stories is being taught at a university in India, a story about the monsoon.
Tamil Nadu, right.
Yes.
Tamil Nadu. Yes.
And
thank you for mentioning.
The other thing I would say is that perhaps, when UNESCO accepted February 21st as International Mother Language Day, a boost was given to Bangla. The Commonwealth Prize changed to the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. And for the first time, translations were allowed. Before, there were only writings originally in English. And the very interesting thing is that original Bangla stories were allowed in the competition, along with about 5 other languages. So if you write in Bangla, you can send a short story to the Commonwealth Short Story competition and expect to be considered. But the other thing I would like to mention is that there is an online literary encyclopedia in which, for the first time, Bangladeshi writers who write in Bangla have received entries. So people who want to work on Bangladeshi writers but do not understand Bangla can go to the literary encyclopedia and discover, for example, Nirmalan Dugun and Abul Hassan. So I think that is a great achievement.
Okay, Appa. You have just published a new book called The Demoness, which says the best Bengali stories from 1971 to 2021 from Aleph book. So I would like to, it celebrates the golden jubilee of the independence of Bangladesh. How did you manage to choose the stories? I would just like to know, because you say the best best Bengali stories.
Yes, actually that was not the title I gave, but Aleph has a series which they call the greatest, the greatest Bengali stories, the greatest Punjabi stories, the greatest Urdu stories. I'm not very happy with that title, but they wanted to bring out, stories from Bangladesh, and because this is the golden jubilee of Bangladesh, they slightly changed the title, and they have brought out, Aleph has brought out the best Bengali stories, and I noticed that the best Bengali stories has nothing by any writer from Bangladesh. So I felt that I had to include Qazi Nazrul Islam because he began as a writer of fiction. And one of his most remarkable, his Bandhanara is remarkable because he gets into the heart and psyche of women. And the story Rakhushi, that's the title
Demoness.
in Bangla, the Demoness. When I sent the story to Aleph was very happy. And I said, the name Bangladesh predates the state. Nazrul Islam in one of his songs says, Ei Amader Bangladesh. Bangladesh as a state had not been born. So I included stories from this part of Bengal by writers who became citizens of Bangladesh. So Nazrul Islam, he was brought over to Bangladesh after liberation. He got his citizenship and he is the national poet. There's one writer there who did not receive his citizenship, that is Sayyid Waliullah. He was in Paris, he did a lot of work for Bangladesh, but unfortunately he died in October that year. So I tried to get the best stories, meaning that writers who won awards, but I also included some young writers who I think will be getting awards later on. Just one moment. I couldn't always include the best stories. For example, Hassan Azizul Haq's story on partition is a wonderful story. It's been translated into English as The Daughter and the Oleander, but because of copyright, we could not include that story.
It is a book.
The last question. Jackie,
yes,
last question.
yes. I will ask you. I just want to ask you. You have done. You've written in various genres, like research work. You have a lot of research work, and you also have fiction writing in your credit. I mean, so how do you separate these two entities when you write fiction and when you write research articles? Are there any conflict between the two? This is my last question to you, Niaz ma'am.
Thank you so much, Jackie. No, there is no conflict. In fact, very often stories develop from my research interest. Some years ago, at a folk festival organized by FOSWAL, I presented a paper on Baro Mashi or Bara Masa. And out of that emerged a novel called the Baro Mashi Tapes.
Tapes, yes.
In the same way, I've been doing some research for a paper for Dhaka University's 100th anniversary. And in the course of that research, I came across a story, a fact, which I am transforming into a story. And I hope I will include it in a collection of stories on 21 February. Next year is a 70th anniversary of the 21st February 1952. So thank you, Jackie, for your question.
Thank you so much for your time. And thank you, FOSWAL, for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to take part in this session. I thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our final conversationalist is Arun Gupta, who will be in conversation with Abhi Subedi from Nepal. Mr. Arun Gupta, please.
Hello, namaskar, and my greetings to Ajit Kaur Didi and all of you. And I'm going to converse with Professor Subedi. Let me introduce him a little bit about his academic activities. He's a scholar of what I call inter-art communication, writing plays, poems, essays, and teaching literature, and performing and appearing in documentaries. I'm also working with him on art documentaries. He dances, he plays music, musical instruments, and sings English to Bengali songs, he can speak in more than 5 or 6 languages. So what is striking for me about him is his ideas, which are reflected in all such activities. And I was his former student and then colleague, and still teaching and working together and acting and performing together. So it's difficult for me to talk about my guru within 4 or 5 minutes. But what I want to converse with him is this very idea in his works, in his plays, in his poems, in his essays. Let me recall Saul Bellows in More Die of Heartbreak. Not as famous as The Good Earth, but one of my favorites. And he calls the city, for instance, the city as the expression of the human experience it embodies. And this includes all personal history. What I want to know from you is that this personal history, the personal history of a poet, the personal narrative of a writer, is always in communication with multiple histories, like cultural history, national history, history with time, space, region, community, city. So, and when there is this break between, I will give example of how this break is visible in South Asian literary tradition, South Asian political tradition. The personal is very much in crisis, but we cannot understand the national history, the regional history without the personal history. And when I read your works, when I work with you in multiple documentaries, this personal appears frequently in your plays, in your essays, in your poems, in your short stories. So what is your view about this personal and this larger cultural history, which for me is very necessary most of the time, and which for all of us are very significant communication between personal and the larger?
Thank you, Arun, for this question. I'd like to first of all greet Didi and all the friends from Bangladesh who's discussed about literature, translation, and the very important projects. Was very fascinating. But I guess you and I are not going to discuss about Nepali literature as such. We're going to, in a few minutes, given to us about, as you said, the experience, about writing, about the projection of the self into the writing. In my case, the projection of the self in my writing comes from my journey, actually, the journey from in space and time. It's born in a countryside, rural area, moving to the city areas for education. I kind of change in my entire perspective, and then my writing. So the self that you mentioned in my writing comes from that journey, that trajectory that I always kind of found myself in. And I consider the role of the self in writing is very important. Both, as you mentioned, I consider the projection of self even in history writing, in the social discourse, in literary writing. The projection of the self is very, very important. I project myself, my persona in my writing, because I consider that as a very important reality, important dynamics, important power. The first thing I just want to say is that I moved to the city, and the city, Kathmandu city, for example, the city, as you mentioned, became myself, my place where I went out in search of the meaning in that self, a kind of a Odysseus for me, which I wrote a long poem which you performed on the stage, Kathmandu Odyssey. That kind of search, that kind of quest is everybody's essence of everybody's writing. That's the reason why I project myself. But then I'm very confident that I'm not writing that about myself. I'm writing that about everybody. But then the one who writes is the person who takes the stake, who takes the crisis. Writing is a crisis, a kind of a crusade, actually. So in that crusade, minuscule crusade, smaller moments of writing, that I find projecting myself as a very important element in that. That is why I perhaps use myself in my essays, especially my poem Naturally and my plays. Thank you for raising this point.
Yeah, and this is true not only about the writer who is writing books, but also about the teacher who is talking to the students in the class. This is very, because I'm talking about this, means I have told you about it. Like when Professor Gayatri Spivak was in Kathmandu and we were working on South Asian studies, she started telling, she started the session by telling a story. And then one of the American professors who accompanied her just objected to those stories and said, your anecdotes, she was using personal anecdotes. She was using anecdotes, she has used anecdotes even while writing Can the Subaltern Speak, while means writing multiple works, the personal. And when she speaks, many I have heard, for instance, you know, my Dada Manjurul Islam, when he talks about, he produces anecdotes. And so the personal of the professor, but this personal narrative, you know, I thought that this Spivak or your personal stories sometimes, which you, if you are talking about, for instance, Saul Bellow, or if you are teaching literary criticism, but the personal comes in. But at that particular moment, when that professor objected to the idea of bringing in personal in the class, he said that your personal is not comprehensible to the students and it is irrelevant. But for me, and when I talk to you, when I talk to many of my academics whom I know, this personal is the wisdom of an experienced academic. And it is our responsibility to connect the personal with the historical, connect the personal with the literary, which I am talking about, which we talk in the class. So for instance, when I listen to Professor Subedi, his stories, or his stories are very important. The anecdotes, the narratives, you know, the allegories are very important for me in the class, because everyone cannot produce those anecdotes. I have heard you producing anecdotes after anecdotes, talking about Derrida in the class and writing about Jacques Derrida, very complex theoretical writing, but you brought the stories from your village, your friend, deaf and dumb friend who was cleaning the streets on the mountains, and out of those traces you brought. So what do you think about this?
Writing essays is an act of invention, you see. When I start writing something, let's say essays, I accept a big challenge. That's a big challenge for me. So to me, the whole process is a process of invention. And when I enter into that process of invention, I cannot ignore one thing very importantly, that is me, my experience. I cannot ignore my experience. And so I enter that realm of experience with myself, with me there. So without me, there is no invention. So the fellow who criticized Spivak, he probably missed the whole point about her scholarship. Her scholarship stands on this very sense of personal experience, her observation. So my experience is that you're writing about yourself, narrating your narratives, bringing out the narratives in classroom, outside, in performances, in the plays is the kind of very important device, very invention, process of invention. It is for that reason I use my personal narratives. When I go to a certain place, the place like, for example, Kathmandu becomes my mind. Kathmandu is my mind. So whenever I write about Kathmandu in plays, in essays, or in poetry, I bring myself out and have my reaction of growing in a city, discovering a city. So that self, therefore, is a very important element in the process of in the process of creation, in the process of writing. And I also believe very strongly that in historical writing, historical interpretation, critical interpretation, even in social discourse, the writer should project the self, the persona of the writer, very importantly. I don't believe in a very cold, impersonal, detached kind of writing. There should be the element of persona, the self in all kinds of writing. That's the essence of invention, I think. That is how I use personal anecdotes, stories, narratives. My plays are all based on my experience, actually. So there is also my persona. But by using the persona, I move on to the larger sphere of the society, larger realms of experience, and go with that person. So a number of my characters, when I see performed on the stage, they appear to be representing me. Some of them speak like me. So I feel very satisfied. And others also become very satisfied when they encounter my very personalized stories in my essays and in my plays. So I think that's an element of power and element of invention. That's what, as you mentioned, Manzurul Islam and Kaysar Haq in his poetry, basically when he wrote writes poems, he does that. So friends in the subcontinent also, especially a lot of friends in Bangladesh and also in India, Didi's writing, they have always inspired me. The very personal element that Didi projects in her writing, you must have read her autobiography, her stories of her experience about during the time of the riots in India and so on. So her weapon is persona. She comes with her persona. You see, why? Because that is the most powerful element of a writer. And people should not misunderstand the writer for their use of the persona. That is a wonderful process of invention. That is my strong belief.
Sir,
Mr. Arun Gupta, 3 minutes are there.
Okay.
One last question.
So, yes, I'm not going to ask any question, but I mean, I'm talking about these allegories and anecdotes, which that particular professor missed. And when I talk to many of the scholars in South Asia, many of the poets, the personal comes so very frequently, and those are very joyous moments because they build up upon the entire analysis of culture, human behavior, and everything. So I don't know, I am not going to generalize, but at times, you know, this South Asianist, this personal which comes into the broader discourse of literature and culture becomes so important. So I was very irritated, or I am irritated. I do not like if someone says that Professor Subedi talks about his personal experiences, or Spivak talks about those personal allegories, or any one of us. I don't understand that why a reader or listener or cannot connect those two. It is your responsibility to make the effort to see the writer's personal and that larger historical narrative.
Yes, you should
That's all.
move undeterred. You should
Yes.
move on. That's your modus operandi, your style, your energy, and so on. I do that without any hesitation.
Thank you, sir.
It's
Thank
really wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. So now I request Dr. K. Srinivas Rao to say a few words because it's been a wonderful conference. Sir, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rajmohan. Friends, it has been 4 wonderful days of literary confluence and much needed learning curve for me. I'm sure all the viewers enjoyed all the sessions and all the participants of this edition of South Asian Literary Conference, again held online due to the impact of pandemic, benefited as well. And it was such a pleasure to listen to all the readings of poetry and stories, paper presentations, panel discussions, and interviews covering a wide range of subjects. All this is possible only due to the energy, enthusiasm, encouragement, and support of Madam Ajit Kaurji and wonderful friends of FOSWAL. I congratulate Ajit Kaurji and her team. I thank from the bottom of my heart every single poet, writer, scholar, and critic who participated in this 4-day event. When we organized first online SAARC Writers Conference in March early this year, we were not very sure of what to expect. But thanks to wonderful support by Ajit Kaurji, all the writers from the SAARC nations, we not only successfully organized South Asian Literary Conference online once, but twice this year. So big thanks to all the writers, scholars, and poets from all the South Asian nations who participated in this event. Hope we can organize more in the years to come too. I also thank all my colleagues in the Sahitya Akademi who conducted these sessions so meticulously. Thank you all.
Ajit Kaur, ma'am. Miss Ajit Kaur.
मैडम अजीत कौर जी, आप भी कुछ बोले कंक्लूजन में? हाँ, अभी ठीक, बताइए.
It was marvelous to see all my old friends whom I have been communicating for the last 34 years. Professor Nyazawad, Professor Amit Bedi, Bimal Kuma, are my chums, my old friends. Gupta, Dr. Gupta, welcome all of them. And all the others who have been speaking their thoughts, their poetry, their short stories, and sharing their papers with us during the last 4 days. It was marvelous. At my age of 87, I can hardly sit through all this, but I have been sitting through all the sessions, all the 4 days, because I love all of you. I love you. I created this connectivity with my bare hands over the years. Thank you.
I mean, it has been really it's a great pleasure for us. And you were talking about connectivity, Ms. Ajit Kaur. You'll be very happy to know this morning I'm coordinating this session from Chennai. So this morning, somebody came, some English professors came and met me, and they asked about Jackie Kabir. I said, please, there is a conference going on. Please do watch this session. So because of your initiative, so people in Tamil Nadu are viewing Jackie Kabir. First time they are listening to it. Because it's all because of your initiative, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Very much.